Welcome to Justice Trek. My name is Ted Kilvington, and this is an audio and video log that journeys through comic book history as I discuss individual comic book stories of Star Trek, the Justice Society, and the world's greatest superheroes, the Justice League of America. Justice Trek is the only show devoted to the entirety of these great comic book series, from the 1940 debut of the JSA, the launch of the JLA and Star Trek comic books in the 1960s, and right up to comics hot off today's shelves. This show will impact you in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hey, my name's Ted Kilvington, and I'd like to thank you for being here for the second episode of Justice Trek, my video and audio log project. In today's episode, it will be a Trek Tuesday, where I am covering a classic Star Trek comic book, in this case, the very first Star Trek comic book, Gold Key's Star Trek #1 from 1967. Now, not only was this the first Star Trek comic book ever published, but it was also the very first expanded universe Star Trek comic book. In other words, the TV show started in '66, and there were a few adaptations of some of the episodes, prose adaptations, but there were no original Star Trek stories told outside of the original series that first year. So the very first original Star Trek story outside of the original series was Gold Key Star Trek #1 from 1967, and we're going to talk about it today. So, hope you caught my first episode where I covered the classic Justice League of America number 137 from 1976, with the very first meeting of Superman and the original Captain Marvel, Shazam. If you may hear some random cat noises, the clinking of her bell and the little mewing sounds as she jumps around, she gets a little jealous when I'm talking to other people, whether it's you folks here on the internet or whether it's I'm doing a video call with my colleagues at work. But if you hear her crying or you see her on the screen, it's because she's jealous of you folks. She doesn't like that she has to share me with you. Alrighty. So, the very first time I read today's comic book was 6 months ago, when I bought the volume #1, the very first volume of the Star Trek graphic novel collection from Eagle Moss, which is a British publisher which tried to reprint every Star Trek comic book ever in hardcover format in deluxe volumes. I say try to because they got about 150 volumes in, and then sales weren't where they thought they should be to continue, so they stopped. They did cover all of the Gold Key comics. They covered all of the Marvel comics, as far as I know, but they didn't get to all the DC comics or all the IDW comics. But for our purposes, we're covering Gold Key Star Trek #1. Now, I call it Gold Key because the publisher of that first Star Trek comic book series was named Gold Key Comic Books. The actual comic name was Star Trek, but of course there was, a Gold Key Star Trek #1, a Marvel Comics Star Trek #1, a DC Comics Star Trek #1, and an IDW, which stands for Ideas and Design Works, an IDW Star Trek #1. DC, for what it's worth, stands for Detective Comics, but that hasn't been really used in that sense since 1939. More on that in the next episode. But today, Trek Tuesday. So, you may notice I have these volumes here. These gorgeously bound volumes from Eagle Moss. And when I got this Star Trek graphic novel collection, Volume 1, last fall, in preparation for this podcast, that's the first time I read Gold Key Star Trek #1. Now, I had read other Star Trek comics from Gold Key before, but this is the first time I read the issue from 1967. Okay. So I'm covering this first out of all the Star Trek comics, of course, because it was the very first Star Trek comic book. Now, a little bit of info about how I'm going to do my coverage on this show from here on out. I'm going to alternate between Star Trek Tuesdays, or Trek Tuesdays, and Justice Fridays, where I'll talk about Justice League, Justice Society, and Crisis on Infinite Earths comic books. For Trek Tuesdays, however, I'm going to alternate between the classic Gold Key comics. I'll do one of those, and then I'll do a story arc from the 80s comics from Marvel and DC, and then up until the 90s Marvel and DC comics. And then I'll do a story arc from IDW. So we'll have one comic from the classic Gold Key, and then a story arc, where if a story covers multiple issues, I'll cover each issue in sequence with one episode covering one issue, and followed by a story arc from IDW Comics, where so if, for example, I might cover like a 3-part Star Trek series or a Star Trek story from DC Comics from the 80s, followed by a 5-part IDW arc from, well, sometime in the last 17 years that they've been publishing Star Trek comics at IDW, followed by a Gold Key story, and then all of the Gold Key stories were self-contained. And then we'll keep going on from there. If that's too confusing, just remember Trek Tuesday, and you'll get your Trek comic fix. Alrighty, so let's see. Now, Star Trek, the franchise. I'm on the show. You're going to have to accept the fact that I do the show now. You don't want to be up here with me, do you? Kittens. Star Trek, the franchise, as all good Trekkies know, was born when the original episode of the original series aired on September 8th, 1966 on NBC. Now, there was, of course, the pilot episode, The Cage, which was previously made and shown to NBC, but it didn't actually air till many years later, over 20 years later, in fact. In fact, it didn't actually air when it was first released. It was released straight to video cassette, which I bought when it first came out, and I watched it until I no longer had a VCR. But that was kind of still in the, shall we say, gestational stage. So while Star Trek was developed, obviously, before September 8th, 1966, it wasn't born until that day. Now, the Cage, of course, there were some differences. Both the Cage and the final original series version, both of them had Mr. Spock, for example. Although in the Cage, Mr. Spock was science officer, but he was not first officer. The first officer on that, played by Majel Barrett, was #1. The captain on that Cage pilot was Jeffrey Hunter, who played Captain Christopher Pike. Obviously, we all know Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, was on the original series. They had different doctors. There were some technological differences. In the Cage, they never used the word starship. They actually called it the Space Vehicle Enterprise. Really glad they came up with the name Starship. But once the original series finally aired on NBC, it was born, and it has been part of world culture ever since. So in the terms of the 1960s, Star Trek was only moderately successful on TV. However, it was instantly beloved by science fiction fans. Star Trek, I don't think it is too much of a stretch to say, was certainly the best science fiction show on American television up to that point. I don't know too many people who would argue that point. And if you would like to argue, don't bother, because I'm not going to waste my time. But it had the concepts, and the themes that Star Trek and that science fiction fans wanted, and they're glad to finally see these in full color on network television. So the Bantam Books did a series of the episode adaptations in January of 1967. They're done in short story format, so they would have like one book with multiple short story adaptations of the TV episodes. And then in July of that year, Gold Key Comics published their first issue of Star Trek. And now, fan reaction to the comic books was not as positive as it was to the TV show. Eager for any new Star Trek content, the Star Trek fans, the Trekkies, went out and bought Star Trek comics. But comic books in 1967 were still viewed as primarily a thing for children. And Star Trek comic books weren't written and drawn to be as sophisticated and as intellectually thought-provoking as the Star Trek TV show. It's basically, Star Trek for 10-year-olds. So whenever I talk about the comics from the 60s, bearing in mind, they never intended for adults to be discussing this stuff 55 years later. They intended... Sorry, thought I heard a noise. They were intending it for children to enjoy it as disposable entertainment back in the 60s. A lot of the adult Star Trek fans, the adult Trekkies who went out and bought the Star Trek comic books, they had very mixed reaction. I mean, they loved the fact that there was new Star Trek, especially in the summer when, at that time, TV shows were in hiatus. Back in the ancient days before streaming or digital viewing, a show aired once. It might air a second time in repeats in the summer, and then eventually it might go to syndication. But you never know when you could watch a specific episode. In fact, it might be years before that was ever available where you lived. So they got into the Star Trek comic book. And I don't want to get into all the different inconsistencies, the way the Gold Key comic book version was different from the TV show version, because there will be some, and I'll point some out as we go. But as the publisher of the Eagle Mouse comics said, I apologize, I'm forgetting his name right now. As he once said in an interview in discussing the books, there is no one Trek. The Gold Key comics are canonical within the pages of Gold Key comics. When the original writer Dick Wood was given details about Star Trek, he was only basically able to see what had come out on air up to that point, and possibly a few upcoming things. And the artist for that first Star Trek issue knew even less because he lived in Italy. So he was given a few publicity photos and stills, some of the, okay, here's what the bridge looks like, and here's what the actors look like. But that was it. I'm pretty sure that I read that the original Gold Key #1 Star Trek artist never saw the series before he drew the comic. So there's, like I said, right there's going to be some inaccuracies. But just remember, my personal philosophy is you have to view any form of culture the way it was intended to be viewed at the time it was produced, at the time it was crafted, for a non-capitalist way of phrasing it. So Just remember that the Gold Key Star Trek comics were made for kids. And it was not made by or for adult Trekkies. And it was certainly not made for audiences in the year 2023. Now, the Gold Key comic was moderately successful, and it sold occasionally for up until 1979. Now, one of the weird things about Gold Key comics is they were never really periodicals, meaning their comics were never issued on a regular, consistent period. So some comics might be published once a month, or once every 6 weeks, or once every 2 months, or 3 months. Gold Key comics, sometimes they might do 2 a year, sometimes they might do 8. And you never knew like how long the gap was going to be between one issue and the next. So they had done a total of 61 Gold Key comics by the time that they lost the license and Marvel Comics acquired the Star Trek comic book license prior to the 1979 release of Star Trek The Motion Picture. Now, of course, all of the characters are making their first appearance on Justice Trek, the first time we were discussing them. And the ones from Star Trek #1 in the 1967 Gold Key version, of course, are Captain James T. Kirk, created by Gene Roddenberry. First appearance on The Man Trap, aired September 8th, 1966. There's Mr. Spock, created by Gene Roddenberry. First appearance on Star Trek, the original pilot episode, The Cage, which wasn't ever really, I don't even know if it was ever aired, but it was first shown to NBC studio executives in February of 1965. And then it was sent back to producer Gene Roddenberry saying, hey, we like the overall idea, but we need you to make some tweaks. And so that's why it took a year and a half before the original version finally made it to screens and the hearts of millions. Of course, there's also Dr. Leonard McCoy, Bones, created by Gene Roddenberry, also first appeared in that first episode. Plus one other character from the original series, the TV series, made their appearance, and that's Yeoman Janice Rand. So in that first episode, the first issue, there was no Scotty, there was no Uhura, there was no Sulu, and there was no Nurse Chapel. Now, as any good Trekkie knows, Chekhov, Ensign Pavel Chekhov at that time, didn't actually make his debut until September of '67, the season 2, episode 1. So he hadn't appeared on the TV show yet, let alone the comic book. But so the Gold Key comic only used those 4 characters from the series: Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Rand. Star Trek #1 from Gold Key Comics was published July 27th, 1967, with a 12-cent cover price and no cover date. There was one story in that issue titled The Planet of No Return, and it was by writer Dick Wood. That's the correct name he was given. Every time I hear that name, I keep hearing Beavis and Butthead in the back of my mind. The artist was Navio Zakara, which is why I couldn't remember it earlier. It's not a name that flows off the tongue of Americans. Those are the only credits available. It's not known who lettered or colored that original issue. There was no cover art. They just used stills of the TV show. So here's the synopsis for that first issue. Captain's log, stardate 1809.2. Enterprise carrying out exploration mission throughout Galaxy Alpha. So far, we see no indication of life anywhere in this galaxy. As the Enterprise continues their exploration of a remote part of space, a fertile planet is detected. As the starship approaches the planet, it passes through an eerie space cloud, during which time several one-celled plant spores seep through the ship's hull. Soon the spores locate guinea pigs aboard the ship in one of the science labs, and those small mammals are mutated into giant, hostile trees, although the ship's security team are able to swiftly destroy the strange menace. As Captain Kirk and his exploratory team, including Dr. McCoy and Yeoman Rand, they beam down to the Fernal Planet, and Mr. Spock remained behind to determine what caused the mutation of the guinea pigs and to find a cure as well. Naming the planet KG after the Kelly green color of the local plant life, the exploratory team soon encounters a strange mist. Shortly after a crewman passes through the mist, he too begins to mutate into a tree. Before the team can react, a huge, giant cannibal plant creates a suction force and draws the crew towards its maw. Before the carnivorous flora can devour the explorers, the plant is attacked by a giant mobile tree. The tree kills the cannibal plant and then soon dies itself. That is when the crew notices that the tree that saved them was actually their fellow crewman that had mutated into the walking wood. Captain Kirk notifies Mr. Spock of what has transpired on the planet, and despite Spock's warnings, the captain and the rest of the team remain on the planet to further investigate the mutation. Soon, Kirk's team locates a community of vegetation which suddenly attacks the humans. Defending themselves with their phasers, the team seeks refuge in a nearby cave. But different plants with long tentacle-like vines manages to capture Yeoman Rand. The crew follow their captured comrade only to see her placed into a type of holding pen with other non-plant creatures that are native to that planet. The exploratory team try to blast their way through the plant wall of the enclosure, but the floronic life form is able to regrow as fast as the phasers destroy it. The crew then see that the animals are actually used by the plants as a food source. Being outnumbered by the hostile plants, the crew call on Mr. Spock to use a precision phaser beam from the Enterprise to destroy the enclosure while not harming Yeoman Rand. Spock is successful, and as soon as the landing party reaches their crewmen, they beam back to the Enterprise. Before the starship leaves the planet, Mr. Spock urges the captain to destroy all life on planet KG, lest the plant spores float through space to land on other inhabited worlds. Captain Kirk agrees, and before the Enterprise leaves the orbit of planet KG, it uses its phasers to commit mundicide, ending the threat of the deadly plant life forever. Okay, so here are my thoughts on this issue. One of the things I noticed while reading the foreword to this story in the Eagle Moss volume, number one, their description of the upcoming story, they said, "Ooh, they committed genocide. They would never do that on Star Trek." But in the season 1, episode 29, Operation Assimilate, the Enterprise annihilated all of the parasites on that planet. That was the same parasites that had killed Captain Kirk's brother. He's dead, Jim. So I don't know if writer Dick Wood had viewed that episode before he wrote this script. It's possible. It's also possible they just happened to come up with similar ideas. But I don't think it's that far-fetched to say, hey, we'll kill all the parasites on this planet, to, hey, we'll kill all the killer plants on this planet. Either way, the both species were not really deemed sentient, and both were deemed lethal, hostile, dangerous to mankind and any other sentient species. So I don't think there is that much of a stretch between the two actions. Other things I want to point out Let's see. As I mentioned earlier, is no cover art. It's just photos from the show. One of the things that's common for Gold Key comics is that the copy on the cover to the comic often did not match the story on the inside of the comic. So the cover called it KG Planet of Death. The story itself is called The Planet of No Return. You know, there's a good splash image here with the Enterprise crew being attacked by the giant carnivorous plant, not dissimilar to a Venus flytrap on Earth. But while I think Dr. McCoy and Mr. Spock and Janice Rand all are drawn similar to the actors that portrayed them on the TV show, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, and oh boy, I'm going to get it now. Sorry, old man memory. I forget who played Janice Rand. In many of the panels, Captain Kirk does not look like William Shatner. However, in some panels, he does. So, like, I don't think it's fair to say, oh, the comic is inconsistent with the TV show. It is entirely fair, though, to say if the comic is not consistent within itself. So Captain Kirk should look like Captain Kirk in every panel in which he appears. In this story, he doesn't. Another thing I want to point out is the very first panel of the story after that splash page. It uses stardate 18:09.2. Now, as any Trekkie knows, that's not the format for stardates. Then they say they're exploring mission. They're on an exploratory mission through Galaxy Alpha. Another thing, now it wasn't done so much in the original series, and I'm pretty sure at least once on the animated series they left the galaxy, but in the later series, like the Next Generation and there on out, it's kind of made clear that the Enterprise usually stayed within the Milky Way galaxy. So a charitable no prize explanation of what happened there is that they were just in a remote part of the Alpha Quadrant of the Milky Way galaxy. Now, then there, of course, there's the space fog that enveloped the ship, and basically it was a fog of one-cell plant spores that were able to survive the vacuum of space, the cold vacuum of space. Don't know what their food source or heat source would have been out there, but they were still able to survive. Yet somehow these one-celled organisms were able to penetrate the hull of the Enterprise. Now, come on, guys. Certainly, nothing that's cell-sized on Earth is big or is small enough to fit through the hull of any ship using 20th century technology at the time the story was written. And I would imagine that the Enterprise, having not only the 23rd century technology in constructing the starship, also, of course, had the shields, force fields that were used to keep out certainly any energy type of bombardment. And I don't know if they were designed to fight cellular bombardment, but I think just the hull of the ship alone should have stopped that. Now, the artist Nevio Zakara, I thought, did a pretty good job of depicting the plant life on the show. He did a decent job, like I said, of Spock, McCoy, and Rand. I mean, on the other hand, Yeoman Rand in this issue, her features aren't very distinctive, so it could just be that artist Nevio Zakara was told, hey, draw a blonde woman as one of the crew. and that was, and just, you know, she doesn't have any, just the character in the drawing doesn't have any distinctive features that would distinguish her in one way or another from Yeoman Rand on the TV show. Janice? The name of the actress. Old man memory. Comes and goes. I'll remember the comics from my youth, long after I forget whatever your name is. So the story itself, you know, it's simplistic, but again, as I said earlier, Star Trek comics for kids. You can't say, oh, they're not sophisticated for an adult. They were never intended to be. I mean, you can say it, but you're a jerk if you do. Other than that, you know, the story was pretty entertaining, I thought. You know, they had, like any good story, whether it's for kids or adults or comics or TV or whatever, you know, there's mysteries, there's a challenge. The heroes have to fight their way out, and they have to think their way out. There is a bit of Deus Ex Machina involved, when the not necessarily God in the machine, but the godlike starship above the planet, you know, was able to do that precision destruction of the plant wall between the Enterprise crewman and the human life, Janice Rand, on the other side of the plant wall. That's pretty good micro-targeting. It may be very well possible to have that technology in the year 2267. Don't think we have it now. I mean, the space lasers we had now just aren't that precise, folks. Come on. But all in all, I think writer Dick Wood, artist Nevio Zakara, did a passable job. Nevio Zakara's art, it kind of reminds me of one of the classic comic book artists, one of the classic American comic book artists, John Severin. Mr. Severin drew for the classic EC comics in the early 50s. He also drew extensively for Cracked magazine. He did a lot of other stuff too. I know he had a good run inking artist Herb Trimpe on The Incredible Hulk from Marvel Comics in the early 70s. He did a few Blackhawk stories. I think he did one for Quality Comics, and I know he did one for DC Comics in the early 80s with writer Mark Evanier. But Nevio Zakara's art, to me, is reminiscent of John Severin. Now, I'm not familiar with any of Mr. Zakara's artwork outside of the Gold Key Star Trek comic, but a very competent artist, very competent illustrator and storyteller. You know, all of there's no confusion to the way the story was laid out. One of the trends in comic book art, starting around the mid-'80s and at least going up for a decade, there was a trend on trying to do innovative page layouts and placing that ahead of storytelling. Now, there's nothing wrong with innovative page layouts, but if you want me to enjoy the story, I have to be able to follow the story. You know, there's nothing more frustrating when you're reading a comic than, you know, trying to go, oh, which panel do I read next? Was it this one or this one? And, oh, nope, I read them out of order. Now I got to read the page over again now that I know what order the panels are supposed to be in. So that can be frustrating, and I appreciate the solid storytelling that they did here. And the final shot is of the Enterprise beaming down their deadly destruction upon the planet. Planet KG Kelly Green. Well, planet wasn't going to be KG Kelly Green once the Enterprise was done with it. Now, while of course, you know, the plants were probably not sentient. I say probably because they never really addressed that in the story. But I do feel bad for the animal life in the story that don't know how they might survive without the you know, killer plants as part of that ecosystem. I mean, maybe they would survive, maybe not. In fact, the dialogue specifically says, that they'll destroy the foliage. Mr. Spock says they'll destroy the plant life. Well, I'm pretty sure in that ecosystem, the animals would be dependent on the plant life in some way. If not for food source, then as a way of thinning the herd. Just as when the natural predator of deers in the United States, when wolves their local population is decimated because of the fear of attacking humans. So now the deers have no predator other than humans in hunting season. And sometimes that's not enough. I know where I live, for example, we had a ban on hunting in our county because it was part of a what they called chronic wasting disease, where the deer were infected with this disease, and it would be they were afraid that there might be some transmission to human, or humans who ate that infected deer meat would get ill even if they didn't actually catch the disease themselves. So they just banned deer hunting in our county. Our county is like the area is probably 3/4 rural. And that means there's a lot of deer. And when there was no predator, natural predator like wolves, and no human predator because of the hunting ban, there were a lot of car accidents because the deer were foraging for food, often in places they hadn't foraged before, because their herd wasn't being thinned. It's not always a pleasant topic to think about, but overpopulation isn't good. And think of the hunters like Thanos.
If you have questions or comments, please feel free to send them to me on Twitter under the handle @JusticeTrek, or via email at thejusticetrek@gmail.com. Be sure to include the word "the" at the beginning of the email address. For research purposes, I rely heavily on dc.fandom.com, memory-alpha.fandom.com, comicvine.gamespot.com, the Grand Comics database at comics.org, and Mike Voil's website, Mike's Amazing World of DC Comics, at dcindexes.com. The opinions expressed are solely those of the host and any participants. This podcast is not a commercial enterprise and does not make any money. All copyrights are held by their respective owners. The opening sequence was animated by Craig Smith of Phoenix Studios. The opening music is Dragon Slayer by the Makai Symphony. The closing music pieces are the Superman theme, composed by John Williams, and the Star Trek theme from the original series, composed by Alexander Courage. Both closing songs are performed by the Superhero Orchestra. Under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comments, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
If you have any questions or comments you'd like to make about Gold Key Star Trek #1 or my discussion thereof, please send them to me at thejusticetrek@gmail.com, or you can reach me on Twitter @JusticeTrek, or of course you can leave a comment on the YouTube page, YouTube/@JusticeTrek. Remember, our previous episode is available for your listening and viewing pleasure, where I discuss Justice League of America #137, first meeting of Superman and the original Captain Marvel, Shazam. Please stay tuned for my next episode, where I'll be talking about the first appearance of the Justice Society of America from 1940's All-Star Comics #3. And then please be back here for next Trek Tuesday, where I will cover Marvel Comics Star Trek #1 from January of 1980, the first part of their adaptation of Star Trek the Motion Picture. So So I think it'll be good. I think you'll enjoy the discussion coming up. I hope you like it. If you do like it, again, like it, share, subscribe. Whether you're liking it and sharing it on Facebook. There also is a Facebook Justice Trek group. If you'd like to join that. To share it on Facebook, like it on Facebook, like and share on Twitter, like and subscribe on YouTube. And keep on Justice Trekking.